It is very possible that we're going to live in a world without museums, without societies that can have expert narratives, without institutions to represent the interests of the people, to restore consensus reality.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. What is the future of an art career? Where do you look to find relevant new culture? And as an artist, where do you find collaborators and fans? In art, as in so much else, a lot has changed in the last decade, and the answers to all of these important questions feel up for grabs. On the one hand, traditional art institutions seem both dominated by wealth and starved for resources. On the other, there's an explosion of internet culture, full of subcultural energy, but also of terrible incentives, with a race-to-the-bottom quest for attention that hardly seems ideal for supporting art. The artist Joshua Citarella is someone who's been thinking hard about these problems, and above all, about how to steer a course in between these different worlds. His artwork has been seen in places including Berlin's KW Institute for Contemporary Art in its recent Poetics of Encryption show, which attracted a lot of buzz. But he's also been cited as an authority on the ideologies and aesthetics of internet subcultures by the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other outlets. Most of all, I wanted to talk to Citarella because he seems to me to be a new hybrid type of internet-era art figure, moving between art maker, podcaster, micro-influencer, and community manager of the heady online platform Do Not Research, and theorizing how all these strands fit together while he's at it. Citarella joined me to talk about the evolving demands on artists in the digital era, the changing art audience, and a lot more. Joshua Citarella, thanks for talking to me today.
Ben, thank you so much for having me. I'm a fantastic fan of your writing and your books, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, the pleasure goes both ways. I wanted to begin by giving you a little bit of a backhanded compliment, as a matter of fact, because
Okay.
I think that you're a very influential figure, particularly I think with younger artists. You are one of the people who is most representative, I think, of something in my head I think of as the post-institutional turn in contemporary art, and we can get into what that means. But I also think you might be someone whose name some people listening to this podcast don't know. And I think there's actually something interesting in that fact that there is a certain professional art world, and then there's all this stuff that goes on outside of it. And I think that you're someone who's thought very deeply about where meaningful art actually happens and what can happen in the art world, what can't happen in the art world, and not in the sense that they're figures like Mr. Beast or something, or that billions of people know, but people in the art world might even be baffled by that reference, but in the sense that like there's this meaningful stuff that is where artistic production is happening that cannot or does not happen in the art world for all kinds of reasons. But I do think, having said all that, I do want to begin in the art world. What is your background? How did you come into this space? What are your bona fides?
Sure. Yeah, it's good to start off with a little bit of an introduction for people who maybe have not encountered my work before. My name is Joshua Citarella. I'm an artist and internet culture writer. I've been showing in galleries for the past, I guess it's 11 years now. My first solo exhibition was in September of 2013. And I studied photography. I've made a lot of art, particularly in digital media. I was part of what we would broadly describe as the post-internet generation. And I started in photography, and then I slowly moved into the internet. I moved into sculpture. I moved into performance. And today, I think I am much more widely known for my influencer-adjacent art practice, which takes the shape of a newsletter and a podcast and a lot of online content in which I talk about internet subculture. I talk about aesthetics. I also talk about museums. And this runs in parallel to my art career. Interestingly now, my career is almost entirely in museums. I have very little presence in commercial galleries. For a good few years, I showed in commercial galleries. I sold art as how I made my living. And now all of the interest comes from institutions. I don't know if that's particularly the stage of my career. I'm now 37. I've been showing. I have some experience. And you go through a period where galleries are just less of an interesting context and museums are where you go. But this also happens alongside a constant, vigorous publishing schedule where I put new material out every week. And I've done that for probably 5 years now, for 5 years. I wrote a book in 2018 that really changed the course of my participation in the art world and set me off on this slightly different path. And so, yeah, maybe some of the stuff we'll talk about later is how those two things have now kind of become braided together and started this kind of alternative, or what we might call a post-institutional type of art world.
Yeah, I want to get into that, but I did want to start out with what the scene kind of looked like when you came into it. So we've already mentioned the term post-internet art, which is a kind of a genre of art. Is that what you describe it for people who don't know? It's also a confusing term. Like, we're not post-internet, clearly. We're all still on the internet.
It can be a fuzzy term. I think very broadly we could say that post-internet referred to a generation of artists that came up on the internet when social media was considered a normal thing to do, and it was no longer a novelty. So my peers of that time include people like Brad Trammell, Artie Vierkant, Andrew Norman Wilson, people like this. We all came up as a collaborative project on Tumblr called The Jogging. Right. And that formative era of the internet, this like unprecedented image aggregation where you had never seen so many images and such niche specific aesthetics collected together, those things were really, really influential for our generation. So it's a broad term, but you can generally use it to describe artists who came up on social media. We're talking about in the years of really, let's say 2010 to 2012.
Yeah, really post the mainstreaming of the internet is what post-internet means. And a certain generation of, or micro-generation or micro-movement of artists who were exploring what that looked like, what that felt like. You know, that was the content of the work. I did want to ask you about The Jogging. For people who were around in that time period, it left an imprint. I mean, it was one of the art things that happened in a purely online space that had this very interesting status that I think feeds into some of the later developments we'll talk about, that was both fully legible as art, but also fully legible as something else, or existed wholly in like the Tumblr space. Yeah, and this was a collective project of 20 people.
We had a rotating group of contributors, so I would say that in its entirety, there were probably 20 people who came through the project and participated for different times. I was one of the core members for many, many years. For people who are maybe not familiar with this idea of encountering an artwork on the internet, we at the time had called that the accidental audience, meaning this was a project that was intentionally put together by artists to create certain cultural provocations. We were pairing miscellaneous strange materials together, making these improvised sculptures. This is a very famous one that I did that I still get Google alerts for. It was called the Baguette Koozie, which was a Coors Light can in a baguette of French bread.
That's a good example of what it was. It was like kind of internet surrealism.
Yeah, people brought it to baseball stadiums like the week after. It actually started to have a palpable impact on culture. Yeah. And then somebody brought a loaf of bread with a whiskey bottle in it afterwards. There's even a one-upsmanship in the competitive memosphere. What was really interesting about that is that this was not just a surrealist, anonymous, kind of weird internet thing. It was intentionally done by artists. We knew that we were making art. We wanted these things to travel through these networks in order to provoke certain responses. And responding to the conditions in Tumblr at that time, we started to learn a lot about internet culture, which later bore fruit many years later. There were emergent phenomena, the collision of hashtags, things like C-punk, the famous example.
What is that?
It was a musical genre, but it was an online aesthetic organized through Tumblr, which then people made music to accompany the aesthetic. So this is one of the first examples.
Wasn't there a famous moment where Rihanna appeared on Saturday Night Live and people accused her of ripping off the aesthetic or something like that?
Yes, I believe the artist's name was Anthony Antonellis, who his work was appropriated from Tumblr, used in Saturday Night Live by Rihanna. And this was, at the time, it was considered really in a meaningful way that art was upstream from mass culture, and that artists who had relatively humble followings of a few thousand could have massive impacts that you would see very shortly after, a few weeks after. You could pioneer an aesthetic online, and then it would be rolled out by pop stars at scale. So
they're coming to arrest Rihanna for ripping off. Was she ripped it off, or was it just unintentional homage? I vaguely remember
One can never be sure. There are distinct formal similarities that I think is very likely what I refer to as the mood board industrial complex, which is a group of middle-class creative directors and graphic designers who basically scrape the works in progress by emerging artists and then sell those things to pop stars as insights and set design and so on. In addition to C-punk, there were a few other emergent genres at this time, things like health goth, things like witch house, another musical genre. And all of these have a kind of like weird collision of hashtags where you're jamming two different words together. And this is something that I observed in like 2012 and 13. And then I later wrote about in the book in 2018. Mm-hmm. And you can see some very early pattern matching of how internet cultures create these hyper specific genres.
So how were you thinking about, well, two things. The audience, you already talked about the accidental audience. Like there's an essay of that name by Brad Trammell from The New Inquiry, I believe.
Yes.
That kind of puts this into theory form, which is basically the idea that online something can be art, but its biggest audience will always be people who didn't know it began in that context. And that
right.
produces a certain kind of incentives, certain kinds of aesthetics, certain kinds of reactions you can expect or not expect. So there's that. And then I guess it occurs to me to ask you about how you thought about artistic production as a collective thing. Because now that we're talking about it, during that time period, that early 2010s time period, there was the jogging, but then there was also, a number of other phenomena. Dis Magazine, for instance,
right.
which was an artistic collective that also played with the kind of aesthetics of creative production, particularly stock images. K-Hole, which also was a collective endeavor and played with the form of like trend spotting and market research. Even the Bruce High Quality Foundation, which was a big group of the time, was also a collective endeavor and played around with the form of institutions. And what was there about culture at this time or in this space that lent itself to that kind of production? And what happened to it?
Yeah, I should say that I feel close to all of those artists that you mentioned. Those are people I admire greatly, many of whom I've collaborated with and done projects with in the past 10 years. I think what we're watching is actually a cyclical process in creative industries where there are certain moments in which it is most beneficial for people to, quote, squad up, right, to join groups, to make collaborations. Mm. And then there are certain moments in which it is more beneficial for people to pursue their own individual interests, and the band breaks up. Right. So you observe this in, we could say that maybe it takes every 5 years, every 10 years. There's kind of different larger macroeconomic things that are going on. In the case of jogging specifically, people started to get very big opportunities to do solo shows. That certainly happened to me. That happened to Brad. That happened to Artie, all of the people in our peer group, Spencer Longo, Jesse Stecklow, so on and so forth. And what started to happen is that you just got too busy with your own projects, and so you had to pursue your own thing, and there were less opportunities for the group. I would say that now we're actually watching the inverse effect, where we've seen again,
right,
within like a decade time frame, all of the incentives have kind of shifted for people to once again squad up, to form collaborations, to publish anthology books, to blend their content streams in some cases, to do collaborations and things like this. So it's a response to the particular economic pressures of the period, which I happen to be acutely aware of because I exist both in the institution and also on the platforms. Mm. So there are unique affordances to each of those spaces. I've learned a lot through the last few years. And I would say that with the rising cost of rents in major cultural hubs like New York and LA and things like this, there's a lot of reasons for artists to work together. In the last few years, social media has atomized an entire creative generation where people who previously would have worked together, they then had to stake out their own creative brand, and that's actually extremely volatile. In a market sense, there's just a lot of volatility where your income can be high one year and low the next, but if you have multiple people working together, you can spread the risk and you can all slowly bring each other up. So yeah, I would say that's something that has emerged very recently. I contributed to a book about this very topic called The Dark Forest Anthology of the Internet, which I'm sure we can talk about. But we've kind of spanned in this, just the last few minutes of the conversation, a kind of 10-year arc of bundling young creative projects together, unbundling, and then rebundling again. And I would say that all industries go through similar periods, record labels, musicians going off on their solo projects, and similar things like this.
Well, there's a sort of a natural life cycle of things. There's a kind of a heart beating or breathing in and breathing out in terms of creative endeavors. Young people team up and then, you develop something and you want to do your own thing and so on. But I don't think that's exactly what happened in the last 10 years. There's also, I'm thinking particularly of a text by Caroline Busta called Influencing the Void that cites you from Kaleidoscope from 2022, I think. And this is almost like a manifesto of creative production now. And it specifically talks about, the way I think about it is like the fallout from the end of the post-internet moment and a certain kind of disillusion with the art world that set in, combined by a certain understanding what was happening online that came out of the kind of scene that you were talking about. That's very abstract. Maybe you can make it concrete.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of talk in the last few years that is
a lot of talk.
Anti-gatekeeping. And I got to say, left wing, right wing, I am pro-gatekeeping.
Right.
Part of what happened in that period is that in 2012, your mom, dad, aunt, and uncle all got on Facebook. Previous to that, it was kind of like a closed social group in which people could literally find their friends through recommendations. Not a lot of people were on it. This was a niche interest to pursue art. And it was great. And people could respond to each other. Someone would do a show in London. Someone would respond in Portland. And there was this dialogue. There was this vibrant community. There was a sense of who was in it, who was outside of it. That was really because there were just these parameters around the space, because not that many people were on Facebook. That's all that it was. What disintegrated after that is that the subcultures could no longer really contain themselves because everyone started to get on Facebook and they just got too big and too fuzzy, and it wasn't clear who you were responding to, if the person would see it, if people could meaningfully be in dialogue with each other. So what has started to happen in the last few years is that people have retreated from these big open platforms. Carly Busta calls this the clear net. I think she does so in that essay or a later piece of writing. And they have moved from the clear net, big open social media like Instagram, Twitter,
Facebook. See you, or what you do is transparent and is designed to be consumed by as many people as possible.
Exactly. We might think of this as Web 2, big monopolistic ad-driven platforms that thrive on the attention economy. And people have begun to retreat into more private spaces that are gate-kept. They often have a small price tag on it, or they are curated. It has to be an invite-only group text. These are Discord servers, they're Telegram groups, they're email listservs, and so on. They're private Zoom meetings, things like that, in which people can engage in contextual exchange. And so once again, we have these barriers up around online subcultures. And you see it, I mean, I see this in the organization that I run, Do Not Research. We have a Share Your Work channel where there's, let's say, maybe 1,500 people who participate in this community. And someone will post something, a week later, someone will post an artwork in response to it. And there's an actual dialogue and exchange that happens, which is only possible in these contextual spaces. On big open social media, it's not clear who your peer group is. You need these small barriers, curation, editorial control to be able to cultivate a meaningful scene.
Well, there's another aspect to it, though, right? Because there was a moment when, post-internet art seemed like it was really coalescing into almost like a movement that people were talking about as such. And then the vibe kind of shifted, right? And you've written pretty candidly about the decay of the art world. And in the text I referenced, the Carly Busta piece, Influencing the Void, it's not just about the opportunities of the internet or even the troubles of the internet in terms of, algorithmic being imprisoned by the algorithm or the clear net, making it hard to take creative risks and so on. There's also a process by which the art world, I'm trying to remember how you talk about it, the institutions kind of like have failed to offer a deal that makes it seem like they're the place where things are at, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the institutions have kind of lost the ability, particularly in higher education, they've lost the ability to discipline their workforce. There are very few incentives to keep people from speaking out. And previously, there would have been some type of self-preservation instinct that would be necessary. So, I don't want to lose my possibility of getting tenure. I want to have upward mobility within this institution. And as those mechanisms have kind of broken down, I think a lot more people are just kind of breaking rank and taking their own risks and going out on their own. I would say that another very important part of this is that within those last 10, 15 years, some major changes have happened to what we call capital A art. And this has to do a lot with finance, particularly in the period where I came up. There was an enormous boom of market speculation in the emerging market that was spurred by social media and the recovery of the 2008 financial crisis. All of that money drifted up. Art assets tend to hold their value, perform slightly better than the market. And with the new visibility of all of these social media platforms, this spurred tremendous order of magnitude scale speculative bubbles. So what started to happen when social media at the same time got too big and everyone was coming in, the market started to collapse.
Right.
So you had two things happen at the same time, which is that the underlying financial mechanism that allowed for weird creative projects to get made started to break down. And then also it wasn't clear how to delineate who was in or outside of these young movements and scenes and so on, because social media had just gotten too big. And so what started to happen around that period is that people broke off to do their own weird creative projects, and they took to the platforms rather than the institutions. That started to happen around 2016, 15, maybe at the very earliest. Brad Trammell is a good friend of mine. We worked together over the course of like 7 years on different projects. We did one called UV Production House, in which we ran, this is very ridiculous
totally
to say.
Perplexing
we ran, yeah, it was, one of the better trolls I've gotten up to in my time. So we ran an Etsy store and we made all of the artworks in Photoshop. And then when someone would purchase a work off of the store, we would Amazon Prime ship them all of the materials to make it, including like the screwdriver and the screws and all of the different materials. And we would charge a 100% markup. So basically we made the works in Photoshop and then we ran a drop shipping scam on the collectors. And this proved to be very fun and not so profitable, to be totally honest. But what started to happen through that, we made, I want to say, 250 works within the space of a year. We worked on that 5 days a week. We produced a tremendous amount of material. There was a new post almost every weekday for a year. And what we started to notice is that our audience would start to purchase things that were clearly fake products that would never arrive in the mail. Mm-hmm. They stopped purchasing the large sculptures, the big installations that we made. We had pieces that were $100,000 in which we would do a Katarina Gross style performance of driving a truck full of paint into a shuttered Borders bookstore to spur regional growth. The piece was called Taking Richard Florida Literally. So we had some really experimental, funny pieces. And then we also had things for $5 that were maybe just like a bubble or something that didn't exist. And a large portion of our audience wanted to support us. They wanted to purchase the things that they would never receive just because they wanted to say, keep going. I like this project. What you're doing is interesting. And so at that moment, our conception of what our audience actually was started to shift in that we weren't producing artworks that were going into museums. We weren't producing artworks that were being collected by extremely wealthy individuals that, I would sell $10,000 to $15,000 unique artworks in a commercial gallery. Instead, we were selling to hundreds or thousands of people at a very low price point of $5 who were just there to support the content. And what that naturally led to within the next few years, that's around 2016 is what I'm describing. Mm-hmm. I started to make a podcast. I started a newsletter. I wrote a book. Brad now makes videos. And the discursive component that was always attached to the physical artworks that we made, we were always giving lectures, we were writing articles and all of these things. But the discursive component was very valuable to the people that we wanted to talk to.
Right. Well, yeah, that's the accidental audience again, right? So that's the same insight from before, sort of translating into like where the center of a creative career is fixated on or is orienting towards. I'm glad you mentioned the thing about discourse because for me, as a writer, that's part of the picture, right, is that I do think there's been a real decay of institutions in the art world. I don't think that should be a surprise. I mean, I think it mirrors everything else that's going on in society. There's been a decay in all kinds of institutions, governmental institutions, institutions of work, and a general kind of splintering and fragmentation of society. Certainly a decay in media institutions in terms of their ability to hold the center of the conversation, and particularly in the social media age, it became really clear that the tail was wagging the dog in terms of, you used to think of social media as the way you promoted content, and then at a certain point, it just became that's where the attention was itself. And certainly there's been a version of that in art magazines. I really do think art magazines have, on their own, used to be where the cool kids hang out, where a discourse was formed. And that's really started to splinter and decay, in my opinion.
You see it most clearly if you go to an art school and you ask, where do these young people, aspiring MFA programs, where do they get their information from? Who among them has a subscription to any of these magazines?
Right.
You're very unlikely to hear Artforum, Freeze, Flash, so on and so forth. But you would be, I think, very likely to hear that people are listening to the New Models podcast, for example. They're listening to Carly, they're listening to Julian. And there are these new types of squads and independent content creators, and also a vibrant scene of young downtown magazines, particularly in New York. And all of those things have captured the imagination and interests of young people who are now coming out into this capital A art professional career. And I think we are watching a real wane of those legacy publications and legacy institutions. Are people looking at young galleries? Are they looking at museums to get their programming? I think they're looking from independent media, and that's a relatively new occurrence, and it's very interesting.
It's sort of a variation on things that have happened like music, where like music labels used to be gatekeepers, and then, there's SoundCloud rap, and there are actual like major figures coming up through social media and so on. I do wonder in terms of the impact of this effect on creative making. I do think people's kind of ideas, like the structures of the art world still stand. In my opinion, they're kind of hollowed out, and people haven't adjusted their ideas to what's actually going on. And I think that's partly because you kind of have to go through a process of alienation with institutions where you kind of give up the idea that an art career or art production is going to look exactly like it did in the past. And I think you're ahead of the curve on that. Started as a photographer and artist, you still make that kind of work, but you've developed this entire multimedia, multi-platform career. And one of the things that interests me about that is that when tension is actually controlled by social media or exists online, everything exists in the same stream. As in, like, writing is by a writer is right next to art by an artist, is right next to clips of a performance by a performer, is right next to music, is right next to an art institution posting about its programming. And my theory is that over time, what that means is that if everything exists in the same context, everybody assumes the features of everybody else. So if you're a writer, you probably become a performer, or maybe you're making video essays, in which case you're competing for attention alongside the artists, in which case what you see is people doing stunts and becoming more and more programming-like. If you're an artist, you need the discourse around you, but the discourse is now morphing itself, so you have to produce your own discourse. That's how I read what you're doing. And you mentioned a couple of other examples of people who've sort of pivoted from art into something that's like content production or influencer-like. How do you view what this evolution or the incentives that platforms offer?
We're having this conversation from the perspective of the art world. I would say that if we zoom out a little bit here, we've been in a period of economic stagnation for quite a long time. Advanced economies in the West are struggling to maintain growth rates. The upward opportunity, the upward mobility that had been afforded to previous generations in which the canon of contemporary art was built, particularly the post-war compromise, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the cost of living in all of our major cities has just astronomically climbed in the last few years. And I would argue that the last few years, the last 10, maybe stretching back a little bit further, we are also in a period of aesthetic stagnation. And what I see now are formal solutions, works that have very clear resemblances to the things that were made in the past, and a kind of lack of innovation on behalf of artists. Not to the fault of artists. I think talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And what I see happening is that because the tremendous cost of living and the rewards are so small, so difficult to attain, is that people have actually become extremely conservative in their creative practices. The result of that is that everything now takes the shape of a 30 by 40 painting, because that's the thing that fits over the fucking couch. And every artist is so strapped for cash that they are afraid to take the creative risks that artists may have taken in the 1970s. So you have people who come to New York, they bum around for a bit, they work part-time in the service industry, they can afford, a studio, a rental apartment, and they can make unsellable experimental video work, and they never have to worry about putting their work back into the market and earning a living from it, because the wage floor was high enough and the cost of living was low enough that people had this decommodified space in which to take creative risks. That is what has disappeared from society. We're talking in a multi-decade span right now. But the cumulative result of that is that the artists who now make work, who come out of MFA programs with enormous amounts of debt that they may have for the rest of their lives, they have to emulate things that they already know are successful. And so you've seen this with each subsequent generation where people will make paintings that formally are reminiscent of paintings that have already been made. And they are just risk averse because that's a reasonable response when you have very little resources available.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about this essay you wrote, How to Plant a Meme, from 2020, which I consider to be a very significant artistic collective project itself, which is about the process of trying to move people in a direction you want to see them go. And you document the entire trajectory of really in some detail of what that actually takes, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, to do the kind of cultural work that people always say they want to do, which is build the links in the chain to move the public conversation the right way. I think that's very interesting. People should check it out. But since time is short, I want to talk to you about Do Not Research. Online community you've created, dedicate a lot of creative effort to, and is almost like providing the community clubhouse to kind of welcome people into in a way that comes from all these thoughts about what exists, what are the needs that the art world isn't serving at this time.
I began this work thinking that there were better ways to use the internet. There were better cultures and societies, social groups that could be produced through using the internet in a different way. And I was inspired by the dramatic radicalization of so many people towards extreme right-wing politics, particularly young people, a few years ago. And I thought, I want to make a working model in which I can prove that this could actually be different, that you could use the internet in different ways, you could use it towards progressive ends, and implicit in the word radicalization is that it's actually a process in motion, and that these people were not born with these beliefs, they haven't held them forever, they're actually being persuaded, they're being moved through algorithmic recommendation, through argumentation, and so on, and that if it was possible to change people's ideas, then I should do that. I should pursue that seriously. And so I started my podcast, I started my newsletter, I published my syllabus that I used to teach in prestigious universities. I taught at the Rhode Island School of Design, I taught at the School of Visual Arts, and I put this up online, and a group of people read the syllabus, taught the material to themselves, and then started to produce all of this work inspired by that material. So this was a very profound and unexpected thing. That became what is now going to be registered as a 501c3 nonprofit. Its name is Do Not Research. And we started this blog from people who were interested in the material that I was publishing about, were likely creatives themselves. Either they made essays or videos, or they made memes, or they made paintings and sculptures and all sorts of creative work, a lot of critical writing as well. And that project has been running for 3 years. We're about to have published 300 people. Maybe by the end of this year, we might be around 275 now. It's a newsletter that goes out every week that highlights an essay, highlights an artwork by someone, and we have now meaningfully gathered literally hundreds of creative people into a new institution. And all of that was only possible through taking this path. It's launched the careers of several very successful artists now who are getting solo shows and reviews in the New York Times and big museum opportunities, and it has recreated that sense of community and a scene which disappeared in those earlier periods of the internet when everything started to fall apart.
It does feel like there's a scene around Do Not Research in a way that there's not around some other things. Like, I mean, I've been to your book launch at the New Museum where people read their contributions and people doing actually meaningful critical work, theorizing some of these conditions, making art about some of these conditions. Film festival that you put on. I've been to art shows. You know, whenever people say that art's bad right now, I'm always like, well, where are you looking? You know, because it is bad right now. But I mean, sometimes you have to ask yourself, look in the mirror and be like, is the fact that everything I look at bad, is that because everything is bad, or is that because of me? Is that because of where I'm looking? And yeah, some of this stuff feels like it's the kind of stuff that people say they always want. Stuff that's taking risks and talking about what it means to be a person in the present we live in. Are there any examples you want to call out of things that have come out of it?
We just awarded our first community grant to Transcendence Creative. It's a 3-person collaborative project between Tommy Faison, Philip Kostick, and Harris Rosenblum. And they did this phenomenal show at Lower Cavity, a space run by Tony DeScenza in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and produced this extraordinary, very expensive work with incredible fabrication and extremely high concept. So we just announced actually the awardees for the grants, and we're about to publish the material from their show and the essays and all of the adjacent material that they created for this new project, Transcendence Creative. And it's just been a kind of phenomenal experience. I would say that Do Not Research is a type of MFA program that one could elect to participate in which you have a built-in peer group, you have an educational program, and you have an active community that is all co-invested in these very specific topics. And it feels like a scene. It feels like a scene that people self-select and come into. And the idea that this has been publishing every week for 3 years, I think means that we're watching the emergence of these new institutions that have a kind of exciting, zeitgeisty, creative energy again, particularly at the moment where our legacy institutions feel like very out of touch and have been kind of stuck in the same rut for the last few years. So to be able to respond to things that are presently happening, to feel excitement, to feel novelty again, I'm very bullish and very excited about a lot of these emerging young magazines and new institutions that are being built in the last few years.
Well, okay, so that's what I kind of meant by post-institutional, that there's a certain alienation with the kind of stagnation of a certain image of the art world, and then there are these new tools and people are, instead of waiting around to be discovered by a gallery, I kind of think of it as a variation of the alternative spaces movement, only it's online, and it combines all these functions. I mean, that's what I think is interesting about Do Not Research, is that it's some combination of MFA program, magazine, community hangout space, art institution where you show stuff, and so on. And I do think it's where things are headed. If the future isn't just like totally atomized, like people just on their own grind, on their own hustle, promoting their own brand, it has to be some kind of collective para-institutional structure. I think that you have, from what I have read, become kind of a defender of institutions, though. I mean, I think you do start out from a point of view that institutions, the gatekeepers as they are, aren't serving us. But correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've come around on that.
Who better to make the argument? I exist on the platforms. I have my own independent media and publishing. And if I say it, that probably is a pretty strong indication that it's a good argument, because I don't have a conflict of interest in it. And a lot of the people who are arguing for defending institutions and so on, they're just paid by them. They're paid by them, so you can't believe what they're saying. I think I would exactly agree with what you said, in that there's very possibly a cultural future in America of complete and total atomization where everything resembles TikTok. And this is the liquidation of institutions. It is turning every museum into an immersive experience that is, to be clear, actually content for the platforms. It's not so much about you being in the space and experiencing the phenomenological or sublime experience of looking at these projectors. It's so that you're going to post it and advertise to your followers, the museum of ice creamification of all programming without any discursive component. So I see a really necessary task of building new institutions. I'm not totally convinced that our existing institutions can be saved. I think there may be a life cycle to institutions. I hope that they are savable. I do hope that. I think they need to bring in...
Isn't that just the financial incentives that they're able to offer people to participate in this system as an artist, as a writer, is just not realistic anymore?
The only way to participate in a legacy media publication or in a cultural institution now is to come from intergenerational wealth. The wages are not high enough. The cost of living, it's prohibitive. There's no one who is not a Nepo baby of some sort who can afford to participate in these things. And that was not the case a few decades ago in American life. So I do think a large part of it is a political fix. I want to prevent a future of our society that is completely uncurated, unedited, and is just the absolute open horizontal platform of just cacophonous cultural nonsense that's going to resemble the For You pageification of everything. It is very possible that we're going to live in a world without museums, without societies that can have expert narratives, without institutions to represent the interests of the people, to restore consensus reality. And so the type of society that's being created now through these platforms is actually extremely, extremely dark. And I think I'm the person to say that because I'm existing on them. I have one foot in either of these worlds. This is often an argument that is probably to my own economic detriment. I could definitely do a lot better crowdfunding and fundraising if I was like, yeah, everything should be TikTok, everything should be Instagram Reels, but I don't believe that. I don't believe that. And I've stuck by this pretty relentlessly because I think this is actually the most important conflict of our times. I think in the context of the art world, if you care about the existence of art in general, your job right now, the urgent task, is to defend our cultural institutions from these extractive platforms that are only looking to turn them into content. They're going to put them into a meat grinder, and they're going to spit out vertical videos on the other side, and there's going to be no discourse, and there's going to be no cultural objects, and we will be worse for it.
So I imagine it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to sustain something like that. So I do think that the future is some kind of para-institution, new forms of institutions. You are also the guy to tell people what that actually takes. What does that look like in your life in terms of you're giving a lot of yourself, your creative energy, your artistic life to other people because you believe in something bigger than your own brand or have created this idea of art that mingles community building, art making, media production, all of that?
You need to believe in something larger than yourself. I would say that life on the platforms is a roller coaster of dopamine in which there is no past, present, or future. There's just this kind of endless recurring cycle. You go round and round. But to build something that has durability, that has meaning, that keeps people coming back, those are very important tasks. They require you to believe in something. And so I think that we are certainly in need of these new institutions. It takes a tremendous amount of resources and dedication to make it happen. And it also requires that belief that you're doing something that will exist after you're gone, may have existed before you. People can go away for a year, they can come back, it's still there. And that kind of continuity becomes the texture of life. I think for people who participate in the art world, who go to exhibitions, who follow the discourse, who listen to this very podcast, you are already invested in something that's larger than yourself. You think there's something that you gain from being a part of this. You believe in it. And if we allow all of culture to be dictated, distributed, and recommended by these platforms without the presence of editors and curators, which is what produces meaningful structures, we're going to be far worse off for it. So my task in the last few years is now Do Not Research is registering as a 501c3. That means I've had to learn just an incredible, unbelievable amount of legal jargon and to literally design the infrastructure of how decision-making is made in this organization, to also be the lead editor and the fundraiser for it and fulfill all of those jobs. It's tremendously time-consuming. This is not something that I do part-time as like a side project. This is what I think to be the culmination of my peer group, my generation's work that was not metabolized into our proper legacy institutional structures. And so we need to create the context for it, which is both discursive, pedagogical, it's aesthetic. And my hope in all of this is that these cultural institutions can once again have a meaningful impact on life and the discourse and everything else. I think that the type of emergent phenomena that we watch, particularly in memes and radical politics and the chaotic newsfeed of the last few years, that people who have aesthetic expertise from the art world should have played a more meaningful role in shaping those conversations. I think society would have been better off for it, and I want to build an institution that's capable of participating in that, and I think that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, well, Joshua Citarella, thank you for talking to me. There's a lot to think about. It's a very hopeful note to end this conversation on.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It is the reality of how other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.